The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD is seen as a symbolic turning point in European history. Not because an empire completely vanished that day, but because a civilization framework that had grown over centuries transitioned into a profoundly changed new order. In that year, the Germanic military leader Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus. He was a young, powerless figurehead emperor installed by his father, the Western Roman master of soldiers, Orestes. The deposition by Odoacer didn't mean the end of all Roman institutions or cultural influences, but it did mark the effective end of the Western Roman emperorship and the centrally controlled empire in the West. Odoacer chose not to appoint a new emperor himself and instead declared himself King of Italy. The imperial authority in the West was formally returned to the Eastern Roman Emperor in Constantinople, symbolizing a shift in political power eastward. This ended an era where Rome had been the center of a vast empire for centuries, an imperium spanning 3 continents, establishing a common administration, legal system, and language, and laying the foundations for later European culture. However, the fall of Rome wasn't a sudden collapse, but the result of a long erosion process. As early as the 3rd and 4th centuries, the Western Roman Empire struggled with massive problems: economic decline, internal power struggles, an overextended bureaucracy, increasing tax burdens, rural flight, rebellions in the provinces, and above all, the growing immigration and infiltration by Germanic tribes. In the 5th century, Visigoths, Vandals, Suebi, Burgundians, Ostrogoths, and other groups invaded Roman territory, with many being accepted not just as enemies but as federati, semi-autonomous allies. Rome itself was sacked in 410 by the Visigoths under Alaric, a shock to the ancient world. By the time Odoacer took power, the former center of the empire was already a shadow of its former self. Administration functioned only limitedly, the army was heavily barbarized, and the emperor's authority was barely present. Nevertheless, much of the Roman world survived after 476: cities, the Latin language, Roman law, and the Christian church as an organizing force. But political unity was lost, and Europe entered a new epoch, the Middle Ages. This transition was later viewed by historians as a caesura, even if contemporaries hardly experienced it as an abrupt break. The term Middle Ages only emerged centuries later during the Renaissance, when people began distinguishing between antiquity and modernity. In reality, it was a long transformation process where old and new structures coexisted. Germanic kingdoms adopted Roman traditions, Christianity gained further influence, and new identities and political formations emerged. Thus, 476 stands not for a sudden end, but for the symbolic beginning of profound cultural and political change. It marks the farewell to the Roman Empire in the West, and the dawn of a new, often called dark, but actually multifaceted and dynamic era, the Middle Ages. Migration period. The migration period, lasting roughly from the late 4th to the 6th century, was one of the most profound upheavals in European history. It not only shook the territorial order of the Roman world, but led to lasting changes in society, culture, and power relations. The term migration period is a simplifying collective label, as it wasn't a single movement, but a multitude of overlapping migration processes, military advances, flight movements, and resettlements of diverse groups. At the center were Germanic tribes like the Goths, Vandals, Franks, Suebi, Burgundians, Lombards, and Anglo-Saxons. These groups left their original settlement areas in Central, Eastern, and Northern Europe in several waves and pushed into Roman territory. But they didn't do so as monolithic peoples, often as loose associations of warriors, family clans, and client groups, whose identities formed largely during the migrations and confrontations with Rome. A turning point was the appearance of the Huns, a nomadic horse people from the Eurasian steppes, who around 375 displaced the Goths from their settlements along the Danube. This triggered a chain reaction. The Visigoths requested admission into the Roman Empire but were mistreated, rose against Rome, and defeated the Roman army at the Battle of Adrianople, a shock for the empire. Later, under Alaric, they advanced to Italy and sacked Rome itself in 410. The Huns, under their most famous leader Attila, played a central role in destabilizing the Roman order. They forced other groups to flee or ally, attacked Gaul and northern Italy themselves, and extracted costly tributes from the Western Roman Empire. But they disintegrated quickly after Attila's death, and many of their subjects sought new political ties. In the following decades, Roman control over large parts of the West crumbled. The Vandals founded a kingdom in North Africa, the Visigoths in Spain, the Franks in Gaul, the Ostrogoths in Italy. From a Roman perspective, these were invasions and disintegration. From a modern view, a complex transformation process where new political entities emerged. Many Germanic rulers didn't aim to destroy Rome but tried to integrate into Roman traditions. They adopted titles, administrations, language elements, and Christianity. Europe's ethnic landscape also changed. Old border regions were broken open. New population mixtures arose. Romanization and Germanization intertwined simultaneously. Thus, the migration period wasn't just a barbarian storm flood, as older historical narratives like to portray it, but a phase of enormous mobility, flexibility, and cultural adaptation. It had profound consequences. The unity of the Roman Empire shattered. Instead, new kingdoms emerged that laid the foundation for medieval state formation. The old distinction between Roman and barbarian gradually lost significance. Former enemies became Christian kings, Roman provinces became new realms. Europe's political patchwork, which would characterize the Middle Ages, took shape during this turbulent time. The migration period was thus a chaotic but creative birth process for medieval Europe. Formation of Germanic kingdoms. The formation of Germanic kingdoms on the former soil of the Western Roman Empire wasn't a planned overthrow, but the result of a decades-long process arising from a mix of military expansion, migration, alliance politics, and adaptation to existing structures. Between the 5th century, stable ruling entities formed from various Germanic groups, filling the political vacuum left by Rome's decline. The founding of these kingdoms wasn't just a military act, but a cultural, religious, and social change that laid the foundation for medieval Europe. An example of this change is the Visigoths. Originally from east of the Danube, they were pushed westward by Hun pressure. After their famous march through the Roman Empire and the sack of Rome under Alaric, they eventually found a permanent settlement in southern France and later in Spain. There they founded the Visigothic kingdom with Toledo as its center, lasting until the Arab conquest in the 8th century. The Visigoths adapted to Roman administrative structures and converted over time from Arianism to Catholic Christianity to bridge the gap between the Germanic elite and the Romanized population. The Vandals, another Germanic tribe, undertook an even more spectacular migration. They crossed Spain and under Gaiseric crossed to North Africa, conquering the economically important Carthage. There they established a kingdom that exercised power through sea trade and piracy and even sacked Rome again in 455. Although defeated by the Eastern Roman army under Belisarius in the 6th century, their rule showed how far the successor states of the Roman order reached. The Ostrogoths, led by Theodoric the Great, also played a central role. They conquered Italy with the approval of the Eastern Roman Emperor and established a kingdom in Ravenna that leaned heavily on Roman traditions. Theodoric ruled in Rome's name, promoted culture, infrastructure, and a degree of religious tolerance. Though the Ostrogoths, like many other Germanic groups, were initially Arian, the Frankish Kingdom developed from the region of modern northern France and western Germany. Unlike many other Germanic groups, the Franks weren't Arian but adopted Catholic Christianity early, a decisive factor for their acceptance and integration into the Romanized population. Under Clovis, who was baptized around 500, the Merovingians rose. The Frankish kingdom would develop over centuries into the core of later medieval Europe. All these kingdoms didn't arise in complete break with the Roman world, but on its ruins and often in close alignment with its structures. Administration, language, Latin remained the official language, law, Roman law and tribal laws coexisted, and architecture were adopted or further developed. At the same time, the new rulers brought their own traditions, such as in warfare, kingship, or social organization. Hybrid cultures emerged where Germanic, Roman, and Christian elements fused. The Germanic kingdoms thus became bearers of a new political order that didn't continue the Roman legacy, but transformed it. Their formation marks the beginning of medieval kingdoms and later European nation-states, making it a key chapter in European history. Christianization of Europe. The Christianization of Europe was a long, multifaceted process spanning centuries that fundamentally changed the continent's cultural, political, and social structure. After the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, Christianity was already established in the Roman cultural sphere, but large parts of Europe, especially Germanic, Slavic, and Nordic areas, remained shaped by pagan religions. Missionaries, monastic orders, and later rulers drove the spread of Christianity. Christianization wasn't just a religious phenomenon, but a political tool for consolidating rule, forming identities, and integration. Initially, the Christian mission focused on the Germanic tribes that had replaced Roman heritage in the West. While some groups like the Goths or Vandals had early converted to Arianism, a form of Christianity deemed heretical, it was the baptism of Frankish King Clovis I around 500 that marked a turning point. Clovis was baptized in the Catholic rite, securing support from the Roman clergy and the Gallo-Roman population. From then on, Catholic Christianity spread quickly in Frankish areas, carried by bishops, monasteries, and later royal administration. In the 7th and 8th centuries, organized missions began among Germanic peoples east of the Rhine. A central role was played by Boniface, a Benedictine monk from England who went to modern-day Germany on papal commission. He founded bishoprics, destroyed pagan cult sites, and was later venerated as the apostle of the Germans. The mission was closely tied to Frankish expansion policy. Spiritual and secular power worked hand in hand. Christianization here wasn't purely peaceful, but often involved coercion, political pressure, and even violence. From the 9th century, the mission extended to Slavic peoples. One of the most significant initiatives was the mission to the Slavs in Moravia, led by brothers Cyril and Methodius in the 9th century. They translated biblical texts into Slavic and created the Glagolitic alphabet, laying the foundation for the later Cyrillic script. Their work influenced large parts of Eastern Europe and contributed to the cultural independence of Slavic churches. In the High Middle Ages, the focus shifted to Nordic countries. In Scandinavia, Christianity was long limited to individual princely courts but was systematically spread from the 10th century. Norway, Sweden, and Denmark experienced a mix of political adaptation and religious conviction. Rulers like Olaf Tryggvason or Olaf the Holy supported the new religion, though they faced fierce resistance. The faith eventually took hold, often accompanied by the symbolic destruction of old pagan cults and temples. The path to widespread Christianization wasn't straightforward. In many regions, syncretic forms of religious life persisted for generations, with Christian and pagan elements coexisting. Only with the consolidation of church structures through dioceses, monasteries, schools, and canon law could the new faith be more deeply anchored. Christianization had long-term consequences. It created a common religious foundation on which cultural identities and political entities formed. It brought a new ethical order, an education system, and a supranational network of spiritual authorities. At the same time, it meant the end of many local cults, languages, and traditions. Europe became religiously unified but also confessionally shaped, centralized, and embedded in the power structures of church and monarchy. Once set in motion, this process became one of the most powerful drivers of medieval society. Frankish Kingdom under the Merovingians. The Frankish Kingdom under the Merovingians represents one of the most significant political and cultural developments in the early Middle Ages. It emerged from the upheavals of the migration period and marked the transition from late antique continuity to early medieval rule formation. The Merovingians, named after the legendary ancestor Merovec, were the first dynasty to establish Frankish kingship over multiple generations. Their rise began in the 5th century and shaped large parts of Western Europe, until the transition to the Carolingians in the 8th century. The decisive step to power was taken by Clovis, who became king of a Frankish sub-tribe around 481. Through clever alliance politics, military expansion, and subjugation of rival princes, he formed a large Frankish kingdom. Particularly impactful was his baptism in the Catholic rite around 500. While many other Germanic ruling groups adhered to Arianism, Clovis chose Catholic Christianity. This brought him support from the Gallo-Roman nobility and the church, giving his rule a religious legitimacy beyond the purely Germanic. Under Clovis and his successors, the Merovingian kingdom expanded over large parts of modern France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Western Germany. The capital shifted between Paris, Soissons, Metz, or Reims, depending on ruling priorities. The Merovingians adopted many elements of Roman administration and culture. Latin remained the official language, Roman institutions like tax administration or urban law were partially continued. At the same time, new structures developed, such as the beginnings of feudalism and an increasingly personalized form of rule where the kingdom was treated as dynastic family property. A central feature of Merovingian rule was the regular division of the kingdom among the sons of a deceased king. This practice, stemming from Germanic inheritance law, repeatedly led to political fragmentation, intradynastic fights, and territorial shifts. Nevertheless, the cohesion of the Frankish kingdom was mostly preserved, mainly through family ties, marriage alliances, and shared cultural heritage. The Merovingians were often called lazy kings, a judgment mainly from later Carolingian authors who wanted to justify their own dynasty's legitimacy. In fact, political power in the late Merovingian period increasingly shifted to the mayors of the palace, administrative officials who became de facto regents. Particularly famous was Mayor Charles Martel, whose military successes, such as against the Moorish army at Tours and Poitiers, laid the foundation for the later Carolingian takeover. Culturally and religiously, the Merovingian kingdom was still of great importance. Numerous monasteries were founded, Christianity spread further, and Frankish kingship was anchored as a divinely willed order in the era's conceptions. Grave finds, like the splendid tomb of Childeric III in Tournai, or the work of scholars like Gregory of Tours, testify to a rich material and intellectual culture. With the deposition of the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, by Pippin the Younger in 751, the dynasty formally ended, but its centuries-long rule had created a political, religious, and cultural foundation on which later royal houses, especially the Carolingians, could build. Thus, the Frankish kingdom, under the Merovingians, was not only a political power factor, but also a central mediator between the late antique world and emerging medieval Europe. Carolingians takeover. In the 8th century, a dynastic and political upheaval occurred in the Frankish kingdom that went far beyond a mere change of ruling family. With the rise of the Carolingians, the Merovingian era ended, and a new era began that would decisively shape the Western Middle Ages. The transition to Carolingian rule wasn't a violent coup, but a gradual power transfer where secular and spiritual interests were closely intertwined. The Carolingians, originally appointed as mayors of the palace to the Merovingian kings, had exercised actual governing power for decades. Charles Martel, grandfather of Charlemagne, had gained considerable prestige through his military leadership and victory at Tours and Poitiers against the Moors. His son, Pipin the Short, went a step further. With the support of Pope Zachary, he had himself anointed king in 751 and deposed the last Merovingian. This marked the official beginning of the Carolingian dynasty. Pippin's anointing was of enormous symbolic importance. For the first time, a Frankish king was installed with church approval. This link between royal power and ecclesiastical blessing became a cornerstone of Carolingian rule legitimacy. Pippin strengthened this alliance through military intervention in Italy in favor of the Pope against the Lombards. In return, he received Rome's gratitude in the form of the Pippin donation, from which the Papal States later emerged. Thus, the close bond between the Frankish crown and the Roman Church was sealed. After Pippin's death in 768, his son Charles, later known as Charlemagne, took over rule together with his brother Carloman. After his brother's early death, Charles became sole ruler of the entire Frankish kingdom and developed into the defining figure of medieval Europe. Under his leadership, the kingdom grew enormously through numerous campaigns. Saxons, Lombards, Avars, Bavarians, and more areas were conquered or subjugated. Charles pursued not only military but also religious goals. The Christianization of conquered peoples, sometimes by force, was a central element of his policy. With the Carolingians' rise, the Frankish kingdom transformed into an early medieval empire. It was no longer governed merely as a tribal confederation, but increasingly as an organized state body with administration, legislation, uniform currency, education reforms, and a close church connection. These developments laid the groundwork for what was later called the Carolingian Renaissance, a cultural and intellectual revival that created the foundations for Western medievalism. The transition from Merovingians to Carolingians was thus more than a dynastic change. It was the beginning of a new order where royal power, church, and imperial idea fused, shaping medieval Europe for centuries. Coronation of Charlemagne. The coronation of Charlemagne in 800 is considered one of the most symbolic turning points in European history. On Christmas Day that year, Pope Leo III placed the imperial crown on the Frankish king's head during Mass in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. This ceremonial act marked the revival of the Western Roman Empire almost 324 years after its formal end in 476. For contemporaries and posterity, it was a powerful expression of political, religious, and ideological reinvention of Europe under Frankish leadership. The backgrounds to this coronation were multifaceted. Charles had established himself over decades as the most powerful ruler in the West. Through successful campaigns against Saxons, Bavarians, Lombards, and Avars, he created a realm stretching from the Atlantic to the Danube and from the North Sea to central Italy. His political control, promotion of Christianity even with military force, and alliance with the Roman Church made him the ideal candidate for a new Western Empire. Pope Leo III, under political pressure in Rome, hoped for protection and support through the coronation. The ceremony was deliberately set on Christ's birth feast, as a sign that Charles's worldly power was legitimized by divine providence. The Pope not only presented the crown, but positioned himself as the one with authority to appoint an emperor, a symbolic power claim with far-reaching theological and political consequences. Whether Charles was surprised by the coronation or had planned it is debated to this day. Frankish sources emphasize his reluctance. Later traditions romanticize the act as a divine gift. Clear, however, is that the coronation tied to a new imperial idea. Charles wasn't seen as heir to the Roman emperors in Constantinople, but as ruler of a Christian Imperium Romanum in the West, based on the unity of church and empire. The title of emperor gave his rule a universal dimension beyond the Frankish kingdom. The imperial coronation led to tensions with Byzantium, where Empress Irene ruled at the time, viewing Charles's coronation as illegitimate usurpation. Only in 812 did the Byzantine court officially recognize Charles as an equal ruler, a diplomatic compromise highlighting Christianity's duality, Western Empire versus Eastern Empire. For Latin Christendom, however, Charles's elevation to emperor marked the start of a new era. It meant not just a return to Roman tradition, but a redefinition of emperorship as Christian legitimized, papally consecrated, and supranational rule. Subsequently, the Carolingian Empire became the model for the later medieval empire in the Holy Roman Empire. The coronation was thus not simply a dynastic event, but a cultural founding act for medieval Europe. It linked religion and politics, antiquity and Christianity, Rome and the new Frankish Kingdom into a new world order that shaped Europe's thinking and power relations for centuries. Carolingian Renaissance. The so-called Carolingian Renaissance occurred mainly during Charlemagne's reign, roughly from the second half of the 8th to the early 9th century, aiming to put knowledge, education, and administration in the Frankish Kingdom on a uniform and future-proof basis. Unlike the great cultural flowering of the Italian Renaissance centuries later, the Carolingian Renaissance wasn't a mass movement, but a targeted reform program from above, affecting mainly monasteries, courts, and schools. Nevertheless, its impact was lasting and shaped the entire further development of medieval Europe. The impetus for reform came from Charles himself, who, as a powerful ruler over a vast empire, recognized that effective administration, unified faith, and reliable justice required an educated elite. His vision was a realm based on order, law, and fear of God. This needed people who could read, write, argue, and administer. So, at his court, especially in Aachen, promotion of education, language, art, and religious discipline began. Central figures in this movement were scholars like Alcuin of York, an Anglo-Saxon monk and teacher who became the leading intellectual authority at Charles's court. He led the palace school in Aachen and designed a comprehensive education program for the court nobility and clergy. The goal: revive classical antiquities education, especially Latin grammar, rhetoric, dialectic, and theology, and put it in service of Christian kingship. This rediscovery of ancient knowledge wasn't an end in itself, but served to improve faith practice and rule. A particularly lasting result of the Carolingian Renaissance was script reform. The so-called Carolingian minuscule emerged, a clear, uniform book script that spread rapidly across the empire. It enabled better readability of texts previously written in irregular, hard-to-decipher scripts. This reform had immediate benefits for administration and church, and formed the basis for many later European scripts. Monasteries also underwent profound transformation. They became education centers where not only religious practice was cultivated, but ancient texts copied and preserved. Scriptoriums, writing workshops, arose in many abbeys. Monasteries thus became guardians of knowledge in a time without public schools or libraries in the modern sense. Without these efforts, many works of ancient authors might have been lost. In the empire's administration, the Carolingian Renaissance showed in systematic recording of legal provisions, decrees, and documents. Capitularies, royal ordinances, were distributed across Europe, creating a sense of uniform legal order. In the church, reform led to stronger discipline, better clergy training, and closer ties to the king. In art, significant works in architecture, book illumination, and sacred furnishings emerged, oriented toward Roman and Byzantine models, but shaping new Western styles. The Aachen Cathedral, commissioned by Charles himself, became a symbol of this new Christian Frankish imperial idea. The Carolingian Renaissance was thus not just an education project, but a comprehensive attempt to base order, culture, and religion on a new common foundation. Even if this flowering lost strength with the Carolingian Empire's disintegration in the 9th century, it had long-term effects. It influenced medieval schooling, ecclesiastical thinking, script culture, and the entire intellectual foundation of medieval Europe. In a time of political uncertainty and cultural upheaval, a bridge was built between antiquity and the Middle Ages, with consequences felt to this day. Division of the Frankish Kingdom. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 marked a historical incision in Europe's history. It not only ended the bitter power struggle among Charlemagne's grandsons, but also began the territorial division of the once mighty Frankish kingdom he created. Retrospectively, this treaty is seen as one of the central birth hours of later nation-states, France and Germany, even if modern state consciousness didn't exist then. After Charlemagne's death in 814, his sole surviving son, Louis the Pious, initially continued the realm as a unity. But Louis's reign was marked by internal conflicts, especially disputes over succession. His sons Lothair, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald fell into open war over the division after his death in 840. This fratricidal war ended only in 843 with the Treaty of Verdun, dividing the Carolingian Empire into three large sub-kingdoms. Lothair, the eldest son, received the so-called Middle Kingdom, a long-stretched territory from the North Sea through modern Lorraine and Burgundy to Italy. He retained the imperial title, but his realm was geographically awkward, culturally fragmented, and politically hard to control. Louis the German got the eastern part, the later East Frankish Kingdom, roughly corresponding to later Germany. Here, the foundation for the later Holy Roman Empire emerged over time. Charles the Bald received the West Frankish Kingdom, the western part, with the core of modern France. Here, language, culture, and political structures developed that led to French identity. This territorial tripartition was originally just a dynastic solution, but became the starting point for long-term political development. Even if there were repeated attempts to reunite the realm in following decades, the trend toward fragmentation prevailed, partly through further divisions among descendants, external threats, and gradual loss of central authority. Especially the East Frankish Kingdom, under Louis the German, asserted itself relatively stably and gradually developed into an independent realm with growing regional identity. From this entity, medieval Germany later emerged. The West Frankish Kingdom was more plagued by internal conflicts, but developed centralized kingship earlier, leading long-term to the French monarchy. Lothair's Middle Kingdom disintegrated soon after. The long strip proved hard to defend, and Lothair's descendants couldn't hold it together permanently. From his legacy emerged regions like Burgundy, Lorraine, Alsace, and northern Italy, politically often contested and culturally mixed. The Treaty of Verdun was thus not just a pragmatic compromise to end an inheritance war, but a profound turning point in Europe's political geography. It reflects early medieval inheritance law, as well as the reality of dynastic power struggles. Even if the terms France and Germany didn't exist then, Verdun created the territorial foundations for their later development. Thus, the Treaty of Verdun stands at the beginning of a new order in Europe, one based on sub-kingdoms that simultaneously initiated the disintegration of the once united Frankish Empire. The idea of unity embodied by Charlemagne was now just an ideal. Reality became more fragmented, conflict-ridden, and regional, But in this diversity, medieval Europe began to reform anew. Hungarian invasions, Viking raids, and Saracen attacks. In the 9th and 10th centuries, Europe faced a multitude of external threats that further shook the political fabric and amplified uncertainties after the Carolingian Empire's disintegration. This time was marked by massive invasion waves from three different directions: Vikings from the north, Saracens from the south, and Hungarians from the east. All three groups exploited the military and administrative weakness of many realms still recovering from the Frankish division and central authorities' retreat. The Vikings, seafarers from Scandinavia, began their raids along Western Europe's coasts as early as the late 8th century. Their attacks targeted not just villages and towns, but especially monasteries, vulnerable due to their riches and often lacking military defense. With impressive ship technology, Vikings penetrated deep inland via rivers like the Seine, Loire, or Rhine. Cities like Paris, Cologne, or London were plundered multiple times. But Vikings weren't just raiders. Many settled permanently, especially in northern France, where they later founded the Duchy of Normandy. Some Scandinavian leaders converted to Christianity and integrated into Europe's ruling structure. At the same time, Saracens, Muslim warriors from North Africa and the Near East, threatened mainly Europe's southern coasts. Across the Mediterranean, they advanced to southern Italy, the Balearics, and even southern France. They raided monasteries, trading towns and farms, establishing temporary bases in modern Italy and Provence. Saracens weren't just militarily active, but part of a broader political and religious power struggle involving the Caliphate and various Muslim dynasties in North Africa. Even more devastating for Central Europe were the Hungarian attacks from the late 9th century, ravaging mainly the East Frankish Kingdom, Bavaria, Saxony, and northern Italy. As fast cavalry warriors, Hungarians exploited Central Europe's open, undefended landscape and struck unexpectedly. Their tactic, sudden raids, hard to defend against, as contemporary armies were often sluggish and locally bound. Towns were burned, villages depopulated, entire regions temporarily abandoned. Only in 955 did a decisive turn come under Otto III, who decisively defeated the Hungarians at the Battle of Lechfeld near Augsburg. This victory permanently ended the Hungarian raid threat and significantly strengthened the East Frankish king's position. These invasion waves led to profound changes across Europe. Many regions responded by building castles and fortified towns for better defense. The need for local protection favored local nobles' rise as defenders and lords, a process accelerating feudalism's establishment. The church also allied more strongly with secular rulers to secure possessions. Despite destruction, invasions led to long-term developments. Viking integration in Western Europe, Hungarian Christianization in the 10th century, and Saracen attacks decline through southern realms consolidation helped Europe develop more stable structures from the High Middle Ages. But the time of external threats left deep marks in collective memory and medieval continent's political build-up, founding of the Holy Roman Empire. In 962, Europe's political development reached a symbolic peak. Otto, East Frankish king from the Liudolfing house, later called Ottonians, was crowned emperor in Rome by the Pope. This event marks the official founding of the Holy Roman Empire, a political order invoking ancient Rome's legacy, but linking it with Christian medieval worldview. Otto's imperial coronation wasn't just a ceremonial act of dignity, but an expression of comprehensive claim to unite secular and spiritual power under a Christian universal monarchy. Charlemagne had already been elevated to emperor by the Pope in the 9th century, seen as reviving the Western Roman Empire. After his death and the Carolingian Empire's disintegration, the title lacked a lasting institutional base. Only with Otto did a new phase begin, firmly tying the empire to a specific ruling area, the East Frankish Kingdom. Otto had worked purposefully on power expansion since his kingly coronation in 936. Through victories over rebellious dukes, incorporating the church into imperial administration, and especially his triumph at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955 against the Hungarians, profiling him as defender of Christian Occident. Otto's Roman coronation was the reward for his military intervention in Italy. He supported the Pope against opponents and used the opportunity to claim imperial dignity himself. This showed the empire's not just German, but pan-European significance. Otto saw himself not as mere ruler over a kingdom, but as secular arm of Christendom. The idea of a Christian empire with the emperor as vicarius Christi, God's deputy, became the core concept. This imperial idea linked secular rule with religious mission. The Holy Roman Empire wasn't a nation-state in the modern sense, but a complex web of kingdoms, duchies, bishoprics, and imperial cities spanning large parts of Central Europe. It was characterized by diversity as much as shared ruling understanding. Emperors viewed themselves as church protectors, but also supreme worldly authority. The claim was universal, reality often regionally limited. Internally, Otto relied heavily on the church. He appointed bishops and abbots without dynastic ambitions, directly dependent on the emperor. This Ottonian imperial church system was a politically clever move to secure royal power in a decentralized empire. At the same time, Rome and the papacy became increasingly bound into imperial politics, a close connection that would lead to conflicts in later centuries, like the Investiture Controversy. Otto's coronation and the Holy Roman Empire's founding are thus not just a political event, but a key to medieval order conception. It was about more than power, legitimacy through the divine unity of church and state, the ideal of Christian emperorship as guarantor of peace, justice, and faith. This claim shaped the empire for centuries, even if reality was often determined by internal strife, territorial fragmentation, and papal rivalry. Nevertheless, the imperial idea remained alive into modernity. The Holy Roman Empire endured in changing form until 1806, becoming medieval Europe's central political framework. Otto's coronation was the symbolic beginning, a conscious return to ancient Rome, combined with the new mission of a Christian-shaped Europe. Feudalism establishes itself. During the early and high Middle Ages, Europe developed a social and political order known as feudalism, or the vassal system. This structural change was a direct response to political instabilities, central powers' retreat, and constant external attack threats in the 9th and 10th centuries. In a world lacking enforceable kings, professional armies, and functioning administrative systems, the vassal system offered a pragmatic solution based on personal bonds, mutual obligations, and local protection. At the center was the relationship between a feudal lord, usually a king or powerful noble, and his vassal, a subordinate noble. The lord granted land, the fief, to the vassal, who in return swore loyalty and provided military or administrative services. This land provided not only economic basis for the vassals and family survival, but also for provisioning his warriors. Land meant power, influence, and independence, but always in a network of mutual dependence. Feudalism wasn't a central institution with fixed rules, but a flexible order, varying regionally. In some areas, the fief was a purely personal contract. In others, part of a complex hierarchy of sub-vassals, feudal knights, and crown vassals. Over time, this web permeated all medieval Europe. Kings granted land to dukes, state accounts, down to smaller knights. The king became nominally supreme feudal lord, but often lost real power over parts of his realm if powerful princes acted de facto independently. Feudalism shaped not just politics, but society. The nobility gained weight as a warrior class, while the vast majority, mainly peasants, lived dependent on lords. Many peasants were serfs. They couldn't leave the land, had to pay dues, and perform corvée labor. In return, the lord offered protection from external threats, a central need in uncertain times. The church was deeply embedded in this system. Bishops and abbots were often enfeoffed with land and had to fulfill worldly duties like providing soldiers. This intertwining of spiritual and secular power led to tensions, especially in the later Investiture Controversy. Nevertheless, feudalism was medieval order's supporting framework for centuries. It regulated not just property and rule, but honor, loyalty, and social status. The knight's ideal, brave, pious, loyally devoted to his lord, sprang directly from this system. At the same time, it created a society with clear hierarchies and limited upward mobility. Individuals were almost always bound in a net of personal obligations spanning generations. Only with cities' rise, trade expansion, and central kingship strengthening from the High Middle Ages did this system slowly change. But in its long effectiveness, feudalism profoundly shaped medieval Europe, politically, economically, and culturally. To this day, it's one of the central features defining the Middle Ages as a distinct epoch. Investiture Controversy. The Investiture Controversy was one of the Middle Ages' most defining conflicts and a central struggle for power between secular and spiritual authority. It erupted in the late 11th century between the Roman German emperor and the papacy, revolving around a seemingly formal but profoundly important question: who has the right to appoint high church offices, especially bishops and abbots? Behind this clash was a far-reaching power struggle for supremacy in Christian Europe. In the Holy Roman Empire, it had long been customary for the emperor or his representatives to perform investiture, the ceremonial installation of a bishop into office, often with ring and staff handover. Bishops weren't just spiritual officials, but important landowners managing large areas, exercising military power, and in close political relation to the king. Their loyalty was essential for imperial power, making it vital for the monarch to fill these offices with trusted persons. The reform popes of the 11th century, especially under Gregory VII, wanted to free the church from worldly influence and elevate the papacy to Christendom's supreme moral authority. Their goal: combat church corruption and secure clergy independence from secular rulers. The key point was spiritual investiture. From reform popes' view, only the church could decide on spiritual offices, especially not a secular ruler like the emperor. The conflict escalated in 1075 when Pope Gregory forbade young Emperor Henry IV from further appointing bishops. Henry, dependent as king on his spiritual prince's loyalty, defied the papal claim and appointed a counterpope. Gregory responded with a rarely used power tool. He excommunicated the emperor and released his subjects from oaths of loyalty. This plunged the empire into crisis. Many princes used the opportunity to rebel against Henry, forcing him to seek reconciliation. In the famous walk to Canossa in 1077, Henry stood barefoot in snow for 3 days before the Pope's castle, begging forgiveness. Gregory lifted the excommunication, but the conflict wasn't resolved. It intensified. Henry later deposed Gregory and installed another pope, while Gregory excommunicated him again. The struggle continued under successors, involving not just emperor and pope, but Europe's princes, bishops, and intellectuals. It became a Europe-wide debate on church-state relations. A compromise came with the Concordat of Worms in 1122. The emperor renounced spiritual investiture, ring and staff, but retained influence on temporal aspects, scepter handover. Bishops were elected by the church, but invested with secular rights by the emperor. This ended the acute phase, but didn't fully resolve tensions. The investiture controversy had lasting effects. It weakened imperial power as princes gained more autonomy during chaos. The papacy strengthened its position as independent spiritual authority, laying groundwork for later papal claims like Boniface VIII. It also stimulated theological and legal thinking on power separation, influencing medieval political philosophy. Overall, the controversy marked a turning point. The ideal of a unified Christian society under emperor and pope gave way to clearer separation of spiritual and secular spheres, a step toward modern state-church relations. Crusades begin. The Crusades, starting with the First Crusade in 1096, were a series of military expeditions that profoundly shaped medieval Europe's religious, political, and cultural landscape. Called by Pope Urban II at the Council of Clermont in 1095, they aimed to liberate Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Muslim control. But the Crusades were more than religious wars. They were a mix of piety, adventure, economic interests, and power politics, mobilizing Europe's nobility, knights, and common people for a common cause. Urban's call to arms came amid growing tensions between Christianity and Islam. The Seljuk Turks had conquered large parts of the Byzantine Empire and threatened Constantinople, while pilgrimages to Jerusalem became harder. The Pope promised crusaders indulgence, forgiveness of sins, and portrayed the campaign as holy war against infidels. This resonated in a society where faith was central and knightly ideals of honor and combat were strong. Thousands responded. Nobles like Godfrey of Bayonne, simple knights and peasants formed armies crossing Europe to the east. The First Crusade was surprisingly successful. After a grueling march and bloody sieges like Antioch, Crusaders captured Jerusalem in 1099 amid a massacre of inhabitants. They established Crusader states, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, County of Edessa, Principality of Antioch, and County of Tripoli. These became outposts of Western feudalism in the Levant, with castles, trade routes, and cultural exchange. Subsequent crusades had mixed results. The second, 1147-1149, failed to recapture Edessa. The third, 1189-1192, led by Richard the Lionheart, Frederick Barbarossa, and Philip II, achieved a truce allowing pilgrim access to Jerusalem but not its recapture. The Fourth Crusade, 1202-1204, deviated disastrously. Instead of the Holy Land, Crusaders sacked Constantinople, weakening Byzantium and deepening East-West schism. Later, crusades like the Fifth and Ninth were increasingly ineffective, ending with Acre's fall in 1291, marking the Crusader state's end. The Crusades had far-reaching consequences. Militarily, they introduced new warfare techniques, better fortifications, crossbows, and siege engines. Economically, they boosted trade between East and West. Spices, silk, knowledge in medicine, mathematics, and philosophy flowed to Europe via Italian cities like Venice and Genoa, enriching them. Culturally, they fostered exchange, but also deepened prejudices. The image of the infidel solidified, contributing to religious intolerance. Politically, they strengthened the papacy initially, but weakened it later through failures and scandals. Kings like Francis centralized power by taxing for crusades, while many nobles impoverished or died, shifting power balances. Socially, crusades offered opportunities for second sons and adventurers, but caused suffering. Peasant crusades like the People's Crusade ended in disaster, and home regions faced unrest. Overall, the Crusades embodied medieval Europe's contradictions: religious zeal and brutality, idealism and greed, unity and division. They didn't achieve lasting Holy Land control, but transformed Europe, accelerating its opening to the world and setting the stage for Renaissance and Age of Discovery. The Crusades remain a complex chapter, symbolizing both faith's power and the dangers of fanaticism. Rise of cities and trade. From the 11th century, Europe experienced a remarkable urban boom and trade revival that fundamentally changed the continent's economic and social structure. After centuries of rural dominance following Rome's fall, cities grew into dynamic centers of commerce, craftsmanship, and culture. This commercial revolution laid the foundation for medieval prosperity and prepared the ground for modern capitalism. Factors driving this included population growth from improved agriculture, three-field system, heavier plows, relative peace after Viking and Hungarian raids, and the Crusades opening eastern trade routes. Cities like Venice, Genoa, Pisa in Italy, Bruges, Ghent in Flanders, and Lübeck-Hamburg in Germany became hubs. Italian maritime republics dominated Mediterranean trade, dealing in spices, silk, and luxury goods from the Levant and Asia. Northern Europe's Hanseatic League, a merchant alliance, controlled Baltic and North Sea trade in timber, fur, grain, and fish. Fairs like Champagne's became international marketplaces where goods, ideas, and currencies exchanged. Urban growth fostered a new social class. The bourgeoisie, merchants, bankers, artisans organized in guilds regulating quality, prices, and training. Guilds provided social security, but also monopolized trades. Cities gained autonomy. Many obtained charters from lords or kings, allowing self-governance, own laws, and markets. Walls, town halls, and cathedrals symbolized civic pride. Trade spurred innovations: double-entry bookkeeping, bills of exchange, insurance, early banking forms. Families like the Medici in Florence built fortunes, lending to kings and popes. But urban life had downsides: overcrowding, disease, social tensions between rich merchants and poor laborers. Guilds could be exclusive, and economic booms led to busts. Still, cities became engines of change. Universities in Bologna, Paris, Oxford emerged, fostering intellectual life. Art and architecture flourished. Gothic cathedrals like Chartres testified to wealth and piety. The rise of cities and trade marked a shift from feudal agrarian society to a more dynamic, money-based economy. It weakened traditional nobility as merchants gained influence, sometimes buying titles. This urban commercial dynamism was crucial for the transition to the Renaissance and early modern Europe, where economic power increasingly shaped politics and culture. Magna Carta. The signing of the Magna Carta in 1215 by King John of England is one of the most pivotal moments in constitutional history. This great charter wasn't just a medieval document, but a foundational text limiting royal power and establishing principles of law and rights that echo in modern democracies. The background: King John faced rebellion from barons frustrated by heavy taxes, arbitrary rule, and failed wars like losing Normandy to France. The barons, supported by the church and London citizens, forced John to negotiate. At Runnymede near London, he sealed the charter on June 15, 1215. The Magna Carta contained 63 clauses addressing grievances. It promised no freeman would be imprisoned without lawful judgment by peers or lands law, early due process. It limited royal taxation without consent, protected church rights, standardized weights measures, and ensured justice wouldn't be sold or delayed. Though aimed at barons, phrases like "no freeman" later interpreted broadly. John soon repudiated it with papal support, leading to civil war. But after his death, successors reissued revised versions in 1216, 1217, 1225, becoming part of English law. Its significance grew over centuries. In the 17th, it inspired petitions against Stuart kings, influencing the English Bill of Rights, 1689, and American Revolution. Colonists saw it as symbol of liberty. The U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights draw from its ideas on limited government, habeas corpus, and rule of law. The Magna Carta wasn't democratic, medieval, feudal-focused, but revolutionary in asserting law above the king. It shifted from absolute monarchy toward constitutional governance, where even rulers are bound by law. Today, surviving copies, 4 original, are treasured. Its legacy endures in legal systems worldwide, reminding that power must be checked to protect rights. Mongol invasions. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century were among the most devastating and transformative events in Eurasian history, reshaping Europe's eastern fringes and sending shockwaves through the continent. Under Genghis Khan and successors, the Mongols built the largest contiguous empire ever, stretching from China to Eastern Europe. Their campaigns brought unprecedented destruction, but also connected distant cultures. Genghis Khan united Mongol tribes in 1206, launching conquests with superior cavalry, archery, siege tactics, and psychological warfare. By his 1227 death, they'd conquered northern China, Central Asia, Persia. Under Ogedei and others, they pushed westward. In 1237 to 1242, under Batu Khan, they devastated Russia. Kiev fell in 1240, princes subjugated. The Golden Horde established, ruling Russian principalities for centuries via tribute, Tatar Yoke, delaying Russia's development, but influencing its autocracy. In 1241, Mongols invaded Hungary and Poland. They crushed armies at Legnica and Mohi, reaching Vienna's outskirts. But Ogedei's death prompted withdrawal for succession, saving Western Europe from full invasion. Still, fear lingered. Tartarus, hell, linked to Tatars. Impacts were mixed, destruction massive, cities razed, population slaughtered or enslaved, trade disrupted. But Pax Mongolica stabilized Silk Road, facilitating trade, travel, ideas. Marco Polo's journeys possible under Mongol protection. Technologies like gunpowder printing spread west. In Europe, invasions weakened eastern kingdoms, shifting power balances. Hungary rebuilt stronger, Poland fragmented, Russia centralized under Moscow to throw off Mongol rule by 1480. Culturally, Mongols left legacy in warfare, administration, tolerance, multi-ethnic empire. Though not conquering all Europe, their threat unified some responses, like papal calls for unity. The invasions marked globalization's early phase, connecting east-west, but at terrible human cost. They remind of nomadic powers' potential to upend settled civilizations, influencing history from Russia to the Middle East. Church reform movements. Throughout the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church faced internal challenges leading to reform movements aiming to renew spiritual life, combat corruption, and adapt to changing society. These weren't just top-down, but often grassroots, reflecting deep faith yearnings and institutional critiques. Key was the Cluniac reform in the 10th, 11th centuries. Founded 910 at Cluny Abbey, It sought monastic life's return to Benedictine rule, strict poverty, chastity, obedience. Cluny grew into a network of priories independent from local lords, answering directly to the Pope. This centralized structure fought simony, office selling, clerical marriage, lay interference. Cluny's influence spread, inspiring Cistercians under Bernard of Clairvaux, emphasizing simplicity, manual labor, wilderness retreats. Their white habits symbolized purity. Order expanded rapidly, promoting agriculture, architecture. In the 13th century, mendicant orders addressed urban growth, poverty. Franciscans, founded by Francis of Assisi, embraced absolute poverty, preaching, helping the needy. Francis's stigmata, animal love, made him beloved. Order focused on humility, joy, close to people. Dominicans, founded by Dominic de Guzman, emphasized theology, education, preaching against heresy as inquisitors, but also university professors. Both orders contributed to church urbanization, no longer rural, monastery-bound, but present in cities, near people, social conflicts, intellectual challenges. These movements expressed deep religious dynamism in medieval Christianity. The church wasn't rigid or uniform, but a multifaceted organism where forces vied for influence, faith interpretation, practice. Though many later institutionalized, they created spaces for spiritual renewal, abuse critique, closer clergy-laity ties. Church reform movements helped preserve credibility, solidify societal role. They weren't just religious renewals, but social, cultural impulses, changing medieval Europe from monastery to city to believers' daily practice. Flowering of scholasticism. In the High Middle Ages, especially 12th, 13th centuries, medieval scholarship reached a peak, the flowering of scholasticism. This approach sought to combine Christian theology with ancient philosophy methods, particularly Aristotle's. Central was the conviction faith needn't contradict reason, but both could lead to truth. Scholasticism wasn't a uniform school, but a methodological approach cultivated, developed in emerging universities. It featured systematic, logical approach to theological, philosophical, ethical questions. In a faith-dominated era, it aimed to rationally explain core truths, defend against doubts or dissenting views. Foundations were church fathers' writings, especially Augustine, but with increased ancient text reception in the 12th century via Arabic, Greek translations. Aristotle's works focused Christian thinkers. Engaging Aristotle wasn't tension-free. Some teachings seemed to contradict Christian beliefs, like eternal cosmos or non-afterlife ethics. Still, many scholastics used his philosophy to deepen faith, developing argumentation following strict logic, thesis, antithesis, refutation, proof. Goal wasn't rote learning sacred texts, but intellectual penetration. A standout representative was Thomas Aquinas. In works like Summa Theologica, he impressively linked Bible teachings with Aristotelian philosophy. For him, faith was superior, but reason a valuable tool to understand it. God as highest knowledge goal, human intellect as divine creation part capable of grasping it at least partially. Aquinas influenced Catholic theology into modernity, elevated to official church doctor in the 19th century. But scholasticism was more than philosophico-theological system. It shaped university education, centers of knowledge. In Paris, Bologna, Oxford, others, scholastics taught not just theology, but logic, grammar, rhetoric, math, music, astronomy, medicine, the 7 liberal arts, instruction based on disputation, careful text analysis, books rare, expensive, but oral exchange, debate, argument were intellectual life's core. Despite formal rigor, scholasticism wasn't sterile. It posed key questions on justice, God's nature, evil's origin, state-church relation, human nature. These discussed not just in church, but influenced law, political philosophy, medieval Europe's societal self-understanding. In the late Middle Ages, scholasticism lost influence, especially with humanistic ideals rise, later reformatory critique. Yet its importance undisputed. Earnest, ambitious attempt to harmonize faith knowledge, revelation logic, heaven-earth, an intellectual endeavor shaping Europe's thinking for centuries. Power loss of the emperor. During the Middle Ages, the Holy Roman Empire's emperor gradually lost significant actual power. What began in the 10th century with Otto I Furna's ambitious attempt to establish universal Christian empire with central imperial authority transformed over centuries into increasingly fragmented political structure. By the end, the empire was a less unified state than mosaic of duchies, counties, bishoprics, imperial cities, principalities acting largely autonomously. A central reason was the empire's specific constitution. Unlike France or England, where centralized monarchies with enforceable administration developed early, the empire was marked by special rights, privileges, traditional autonomies. The king, later emperor, depended on greats' consent, support to exercise power. These princes, bishops, dukes had own armies, jurisdictions, revenues. Often they viewed territories not as fiefs, but hereditary possessions independent of the emperor. Moreover, kingship remained elective, not hereditary. Future king, potential emperor, elected by electors, greatly increasing these few princes' influence. They often used position to extort concessions, secure privileges, strengthen own territorial standing. Every king thus relied on compromises, couldn't enforce consistent imperial policy without powerful territorial lords' goodwill. Added was increasing territorial fragmentation. In late Middle Ages, numerous small lordships emerged from larger units via inheritances, divisions, new foundations. This led to extreme parcellation, especially German-speaking areas. The emperor had no uniform administration or standing army, but relied on negotiations, alliances, feudal duties, becoming increasingly unreliable. Still, the imperial office retained symbolic authority. Emperor seen as supreme protector, guarantor of peace order, judge, mediator, but real power shifted to princes, cities. Many territories acted like independent states, minting money, waging wars, forming alliances, conducting foreign policy. This creeping power loss didn't mean the empire's end. On the contrary, it continued until 1806, adapting to realities. It was less modern state than legal order space with common institutions. Deeply rooted imperial idea, the emperor had little practical power but remained a central symbol for unity, continuity of centuries-old order, despite fragmentation. His power loss history is thus also one of political culture based on consensus, federal diversity, regional independence, with all pros and cons. 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War was one of the Middle Ages' longest, most consequential conflicts, dominating Western Europe's political, military, societal life from 1337 to 1453. Over a century. It wasn't continuously fought modern war, but sequence of battles, truces, diplomatic phases, renewed violence. Yet core conflicts persisted generations. English claims to French throne, economic interests, national identity formation, dynasties, princes, power struggles, starting point. Complicated dynastic situation after French King Charles IV's 1328 death. No male heir, so Philip VI of Valois elected king. But Edward III of England, grandson of Philip the Fair, via daughter Isabella, claimed French throne. France rejected, citing Salic law, excluding female line succession. Conflict thus not just dynastic, but juridico-political dispute over kingship, soon escalating to warfare. Added economic tensions. Control over rich southwest France regions like Duchy of Guyenne under English suzerainty. Rivalry over Flanders trade where English wool, French influence clashed. Both sides sought alliances, built fleets, began enforcing claims militarily. War's first decades marked by spectacular English successes. At battles like Crécy, Poitiers, English longbow archers heavily defeated French knighthood. King John II captured 1356, but England couldn't turn military victories into lasting political control. France weakened but not broken. In following decades, balance shifted multiple times. Plague, internal uprisings, dynastic uncertainties, changing alliances, prevented clear dominance. War became attrition, burdening both countries. England suffered financial difficulties, political instability. France, devastation, plundering, regional disintegration. A turning point, young Joan of Arc's appearance, claiming divine inspiration. In 1429, she led French troops to symbolically important Orléans victory, enabling Charles VII's coronation in Reims. Key signal for French throne claim. Though Joan soon captured, executed, her actions strengthened French resistance, revived national spirit. In final years, France gained upper hand. Better organization, artillery use, England's weakening via internal conflicts, like Wars of the Roses, contributed. With Bordeaux's recapture 1453, war effectively ended. England retained only Calais, a last relic of once extensive French presence. The Hundred Years' War had profound impacts. In France, centralized royal power strengthened national consciousness, economic recovery after decades' destruction. In England, political upheavals leading to Rose's Wars. On both sides left deep societal, cultural, collective memory marks. Ultimately, more than military conflict, epic power struggle over throne territory, identities clash, test for new warfare, administration, state-building forms, key event on path from medieval to early modern Europe. Black Death. Between 1347 and 1352, Europe was hit by one of its history's most devastating catastrophes, the plague outbreak, later known as Black Death. In few years, it killed an estimated one-third, in some regions half the population. The rapid, cruel epidemic brought immense human suffering, shook medieval Europe's social, economic, religious structures to foundations. Originating Central Asia, plague reached Europe via trade routes, first Near East, then presumably Genoese ships docking Messina, Sicily, autumn 1347. From there, spread at breakneck speed across continent, along trade roads, ports, markets, overland rivers. Within years, hit nearly all regions. Plague, mostly bubonic, caused by Yersinia pestis bacterium transmitted by rat fleas to humans. Typical swollen, dark lymph nodes, buboes, high fever, vomiting, often quick death within days. Pneumonic, septicemic forms occurred too, faster person to person. With no medical knowledge of causes, transmission, Europe helpless against epidemic. People's reaction, fear, despair, often violence. Doctors, clergy as powerless as secular rulers. In many cities, rich fled countryside, poor left to themselves. Religious faith tested plague, God's punishment. Penitential movements like flagellants marched land, preaching repentance, publicly scourging for forgiveness. Simultaneously, pogroms, especially against Jewish communities, falsely accused of poisoning wells, causing plague. Expression of social panic, scapegoating, plague's consequences far beyond immediate disaster. Dramatic population drop led acute labor shortage. In agriculture, cities, crafts guilds, workers missing, driving wages up, strengthening lower classes bargaining. Landowners, nobles often tried securing economic power via repression, leading social tensions, some uprisings. Demographic shock, also economic. Fallow fields, abandoned villages, halted trade. Europe's economic fabric reeled, but crisis birthed change. Many surviving peasants gained more land, better contracts via scarcity. Cities adapted, transformed structures. Guilds gained importance. Mass death. Collective failure experience made medieval worldview brittle, later reflected in literature, art, philosophy. Plague became central late medieval culture theme, dance of death motifs. Grim allegories, apocalyptic visions dominated intellectual climate. Long-term plague helped bring Middle Ages to end. Uncertainty over human fate, doubt in church omnipotence, profound economic shifts created soil for reform movements, new thinking, upheavals, leading to early modernity. Black Death wasn't just epidemic, epical event changing Europe like few before modern times. Peasant uprisings. In late Middle Ages, deep social tensions erupted in several European parts as violent peasant uprisings. These reflected decades inequality, economic exploitation, rising taxes, growing peasant awareness of rights, societal position. Feudalism, long dominating social fabric, wobbled as oppressed layers rose against established power relations. Most famous, Jacquerie in France, German Peasants' War. But similar in England, Italy, other regions. Jacquerie, one earliest major peasant revolts, Western Europe, triggered by Hundred Years' Wars, economic social disruptions, crushing dues, plague misery, noble mercenary bands, brutality, ravaging land. In Ile-de-France, one hardest hit, peasants rose May 1358 in violence wave. Castles stormed, nobles killed, properties plundered, but poorly organized, no overarching goal or lasting alliance. Crushed brutally within weeks, thousands executed. Message clear, existing order defended with utmost harshness. Far larger German Peasants' War, 16th century, representing medieval social conflict's peak, originated Holy Roman Empire's south, but spread rapidly southwest Germany, Franconia, Thuringia to Austria, Switzerland. Over 300,000 peasants, farm workers, miners, urban artisans joined, demanded abolition feudal privileges, fairer dues distribution, right choose own pastors, access forests, pastures, waters. Many demands in 12 articles. One First Social Manifestos German. War closely linked Reformation. Many invoked Bible messages, justice, equality ideas from reformatory movements. But Martin Luther's stance ambivalent, initially sympathetic to complaints, later condemned violence, sided princes. These reacted harshly. Uprising crushed numerous bloody battles, tens thousands killed, many captured or dispossessed. Politically devastating for peasants, often oppressed even more. But despite failure, uprisings revealed changing lower classes' self-perception. Peasants began seeing themselves as political societal force, rights bearers, not mere subjects. Demanded justice not just before God, but earthly life. Remarkable step in hierarchically structured societies' thinking. Experiences carried in songs, chronicles, folk traditions, deeply into collective memory. Long-term marked rigid medieval orders beginning end. Nobility authority questioned. Serfdom system disputed, new freedom rights ideas taking root, though often crushed, contributed gradual feudal dissolution, laid groundwork social developments fully unfolding modernity. Great Schism, the Great Schism shaking Catholic Church, 1378-1417, was one Middle Ages' deepest church crises, not theological like earlier splits, but massive conflict over authority, legitimacy, church unity. For nearly 4 decades, 2, temporarily 3, rival popes existed, each claiming sole Christ's vicar on earth. This division had not just ecclesiastical but profound political societal impacts, contributing majorly to institutional church trust loss. Trigger: political tensions after Avignon papacy's end, 1309-1377. Popes resided Avignon, not Rome. Due strong French kingship influence. Return Rome under Gregory XV brought no stability. On his death, Roman people demanded Italian election. Conclave complied amid pressure. Urban VI, Neapolitan, elected. But authoritarian style alienated many cardinals. Months later, several declared election invalid, claiming under duress, elected counter-pope Clement VII of Avignon. Schism complete, 2 rival popes, Rome and Avignon, both claiming sole papacy. Christendom split, not just spiritually but politically. European powers aligned per interests. France, Scotland, Spain supported Avignon. England, Holy Roman Empire. Most Italian states recognized Urban VI in their successors, Rome. Double papacy caused great confusion among believers, priests, rulers. Both curias ran elaborate papal apparatuses, collected dues, assigned offices, threatened opponents, excommunication. Church authority loss enormous. How could institution claiming divine unity, universal truth, contradict itself so blatantly? Many faithful lost trust in spiritual leadership. Reform movements, including conciliarists, gained, demanded general council above Pope, restore unity. Attempt end schism at 1409. Pisa Council failed initially. Instead, solution created third papal line. Beside Rome, Avignon popes, now Pisa elected. Situation increasingly untenable until Council of Constance convened, Middle Ages' most significant church council. There all 3 rival popes deposed or resigned. 1417, Martin V, elected generally recognized pope. Schism formally ended, but damage done. Church unity suffered decades. Papacy's moral, political influence lastingly weakened. For many believers, clear power struggles, rivalries, worldly interests permeated highest spiritual offices. Great Schism not cause but powerful catalyst for later developments. Church critical movements, lay piety strengthening, reform demands, ultimately soil where 16th century Reformation grew. Middle Ages neared end, trust in church authority, infallibility, irrevocably shaken for many. Rise of the bourgeoisie. In late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, Europe's societal power relations fundamentally changed. Beside nobility, church, new social force emerged, bourgeoisie. Especially wealthy merchants, bankers, urban landowners, organized guild artisans began exerting increasing political, economic influence. This class's rise closely tied to cities' growing importance as commerce, production, cultural centers, a process gradually breaking medieval estate society, long-term preparing modern society's foundations. Bourgeoisie wasn't homogeneous initially, but diverse groups. At top, rich patrician families amassing wealth via long-distance trade, finance, land ownership. Their capital enabled lifestyle akin lower nobility, splendid houses, elaborate education, political ambition. Simultaneously, broad urban milieu developed from craftsmen, masters, guild members, indispensable for cities' economic dynamism. Both groups shared growing self-confidence, will actively shape life world. Exemplary bourgeois influence, Italian city-states, foremost Florence, where families like Medici shaped economic, political events decades. Originally simple merchants bankers, rose via clever marriage alliances, papal finance deals, shrewd power politics to Europe's most powerful. Cosimo de' Medici, successors not only steered Florence politically, but decisively influenced culture, architecture, science. Patronized artists like Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, close money-power art link, typical this era. In other European regions, bourgeois elites gained influence too. Holy Roman Empire's free imperial cities, northern Germany's Hanse cities, Flanders' prosperous towns, councillors, guild leaders, merchants dominated public life, shaped city administrations, donated churches, hospitals, ensured fortified walls, stable infrastructure, demanded rights versus princes, bishops, emperor. Urban autonomy idea took shape. Cities began self-governing, enacting own laws, even fielding armed citizen militias. Another central bourgeois rise element, banking. With long-distance trade growth, need arose for credit, bills exchange, money transfers across distances. Families like Fugger's Augsburg or Medici Florence developed complex finance networks, soon making even kings, popes dependent. This economic power increasingly converted to political influence via office awards, war financing, decision participation. Despite power growth, bourgeoisie remained bounded. High nobility clung privileges, social mobility limited. Within cities, conflicts between wealthy elites, simple craftsmen, or urban poor. Still, bourgeois rise marked turning point. Idea power not solely from birth, but economic success, civic engagement took hold. Education, organization, wealth, communal self-awareness became new societal significance pillars. Long-term strengthening bourgeoisie decisively contributed Middle Ages to modernity transition, created capitalism's economic foundations, prepared humanism science ground via education commitment, paved way modern state forms with rights participation demands. What began medieval with first city councils, bankers, trading houses developed centuries into societal modernization's driving force, early nation states. In waning Middle Ages, Europe began forming political model decisively shaping continent's future, nation state. While early Middle Ages marked by fragmented feudal lordships, vassal bonds, regional power centers from 13th, especially 14th, 15th centuries, centralization processes set in countries like France, England, Spain, Portugal leading stabler, territorially closed, monarchically led units. This development, far from straight but wavy, accompanied wars, uprisings, crises, internal power struggles, but end more stable with kingly power, national identity, increasingly hand in hand. In France, Hundred Years' War end marked turning point. French king decisively consolidated rule by weakening central noble families, establishing standing army, reforming tax system. Crown became national unity epitome. Paris developed political cultural center. French king now not just ruler over fiefs, but king of France, over cohesive territory with common interests. Growing national consciousness, also via French rise as administrative language, instead Latin, state identity solidified. In England, centralization unfolded centuries, but shaped by events like 1066, Norman conquest. Later 1215, Magna Carta introducing early institutional monarchy control. Especially from 14th century, crown via common law, expanded central judiciary, tighter life conditions control, creating unified administration. English king became developing state entities center where parliament, tax policy, justice slowly formed common national structure. Here too, nation idea grew as more than geographic space. Portugal developed 12th century from Christian resistance against Moorish rule into own kingdom. Land's geographic cohesion, early sea trade orientation promoted strong central power. Especially from 14th century, Portuguese monarchy established closed state entity, supported efficient administration, uniform language, early colonial self-understanding. King John I's successors built powerful dynasty, making Portugal European expansion pioneer. In Spain, unification via so-called Reconquista, Christian reconquest Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule. Long Spain split rival kingdoms like Castile, Aragon, Navarre, Leon. But 1469 marriage Isabella Castile, Ferdinand Aragon began unification, leading Spanish overall state founding. Under joint rule, Granada Emirate conquered, ending Islamic presence peninsula. Same year, Columbus's America discovery began Spanish colonial history, giving rulers additional power, means, resources. Spain became early great power with clear, centralized structures, strong monarchic authority. This centralized monarchy's development, no mere technical administrative change, cultural revolution too. Formation, common languages, national symbols, coats arms, anthems, king myths, shared history. Consciousness contributed nation as collective identity shaping. King became this unity symbol, bureaucracy his power instrument, capital nation's hub. Early nation-states formation laid modern political development's groundwork. True, many European regions, long feudal-bound, Central Eastern Europe multi-ethnic empire model dominated, but Western Europe, sovereign state idea with clear borders, central administration, common identity born, political model shaping thinking in states, nations. To today, humanism emerges. With humanism's emergence 14th, 15th centuries, Europe began profound intellectual shift, gradually leaving medieval worldview, paving modernity's way. Humanism, education, intellectual movement, consciously turning from Middle Ages, purely theological interpretation, placing human dignity, abilities, reason at thinking's center. Focus, conscious return, antiquities, culture, literature, especially Greek, Roman authors, as models for language, ethics, politics, knowledge. Term humanistic derives Latin studia humanitatis, humanity studies. Understood, study grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, moral philosophy. These subjects basis comprehensive education, personality development. Unlike medieval scholasticism, relying authorities like Aristotle, church dogma, humanists demanded critical, text-close, life practical study. They wanted to understand, shape this world, not just theology, afterlife. Outstanding representative, Francesco Petrarch won first collecting, studying, revering ancient classics. Saw antiquity not mere past, but living wisdom, life, art source. Giovanni Boccaccio, contemporary, contributed literary work, studies reviving ancient knowledge. Both shared ideal, education, morally refined, human, enable active public life participation, allow free thinking. Humanism spread first northern Italy cities, Florence, Padua, Venice, Rome, trade, wealth, cultural exchange centers. Powerful families like Medici promoted humanistic scholars, artists, teachers. From Italy, spread rapidly other Europe parts, Germany, Netherlands, France, England. Via universities, courts, printing presses, ideas entered European education discourse. Notable names like Erasmus Rotterdam, Johannes Reuchlin, Thomas More stand for this international humanistic flowering. Humanism had profound impacts many areas. Literature, new genres like essay, historical dialogue, science promoted empirical thinking, source criticism, nature observation, return, developments preparing later scientific revolution, politics, humanistic human image influenced state leadership conceptions, citizen duty, public responsibility, even art renewed by humanism. Painters like Leonardo da Vinci, sculptors like Michelangelo combined nature study with idealized beauty in works, expression, new appreciation, human body, spirit. But humanism, not just education reform, cultural paradigm shift. for grounded, good life question, ethical responsibility, intellectual freedom. In upheavals, time, social tensions, church crises, political reorderings, humanism offered new orientation, faith in human as reason endowed, knowledge capable being long-term humanism, one central European Enlightenment roots. Without it, neither Reformation nor modern science, neither democracy ideas nor universal human rights conceivable. Intellectual kick-off, new epoch, where human no longer just divine orders object, but increasingly self-responsible history subject. Printing press. Johannes Gutenberg's invention of movable type printing around 1450 counts among world history's most consequential technological breakthroughs. It initiated media revolution comparable to today's digital, lastingly changing how knowledge produced, disseminated, preserved. In time when books laboriously hand-copied, mostly monasteries, low quantities, printing opened entirely new communication dimension. Mass, relatively cheap, faster available, quality consistent. Gutenberg trained Mainz goldsmith combined techniques into functional system. Movable metal types cast, reusable, press modeled wine press, special oily ink adhering paper, sophisticated typesetting. First major work, famous 42-line Bible, probably printed 1452, 1434. Masterpiece not just technical but artistic document, Middle Ages to early modernity transition. Invention's consequences immense. Within decades, print shops arose numerous European cities. Venice, Paris, Nuremberg, Cologne, Basel, London. Books, so-called incunabula, early prints to 1500, produced ever larger runs. While manuscript took months, years, now hundreds copies within weeks. Enabled broad text availability, previously small, learned elite only. Printing's spread had profound societal cultural impacts. Revolutionized education, textbooks, grammars, ancient classics, theological tracts, scientific treatises printed, used large scale. Literacy gradually increased. Intellectual life emancipated from monastic tradition, promoted language, spelling, standardization via print. Also enabled new intellectual public, ideas spread faster, debates conducted, opinions documented. Favored humanism, disseminating ancient texts easier, but also 16th century Reformation, whose success essentially depended printing use. Pamphlets, Bible translations, theses, sermons found rapid dissemination. New medial power form born, print lent authority, reach previously unimaginable. No less significant, impact science. Knowledge exchange hugely facilitated. Astronomers, physicians, mathematicians, historians accessed printed works, disseminated own publications, participating growing networked knowledge space. 16th, 17th centuries scientific revolution hardly conceivable without printing's technical base. Simultaneously, new technique changed religion relation. Printed Bibles, psalms, prayer books made sacred texts accessible. Laity, questioning church interpretation monopoly increasingly, led individual piety strengthening but also religious currents. Interpretations multiplicity with far-reaching political cultural consequences. Long-term printing formed modern knowledge society's foundation, created prerequisite school university system, public libraries, critical journalism, democratic discourses. Idea, knowledge, public good, accessible all, took concrete form. Gutenberg technique. Humans stepped from limited access world into written enlightenment's light. Breakthrough ending Middle Ages, lending modernity voice, end of the Middle Ages. The end of the Middle Ages isn't a sharply defined point, but a gradual, multifaceted transition spanning decades, marked by several incisive events. Historians set different caesuras, but three particularly significant milestones symbolically mark the break into modernity. Constantinople's fall, 1453. America's discovery, 1492. Martin Luther's theses posting, 1517. These stand for political, geographic, religious, intellectual upheavals, fundamentally shaking medieval order, ushering Renaissance, Reformation, Discovery's era. With Ottoman Empire's 1453 Constantinople conquest, Byzantine Empire, ancient Roman Imperium's last major successor, ended. For Christian Europe meant losing major religious cultural center, definitive close-old late antique world order. Cities' fall, once second Rome, marked epoch's end. Simultaneously, Byzantine scholars' flight Italy brought ancient knowledge, Greek language west, fueling humanistic education there. Christopher Columbus's 1492 America discovery dramatically expanded Europe's geographic horizon. Until then, focused known Mediterranean Atlantic area, now entirely unknown continent, entered Old World's consciousness. Discovery more than geographic, changed trade, exchange plants, animals, cultures, diseases. Global transformation began, known as Columbian Exchange. Also initiated European colonialism era, shaping world history centuries with vast consequences, positive, negative. Third key event, often named symbolic, Middle Ages close, Martin Luther's 1517 Theses posting. With 95 theses against indulgence trade, Luther publicly questioned church-papal authority, triggering Reformation. Movement-led Western Christendom split. New denominations emergence, profound societal political upheavals. Reformation, both expression, catalyst, new religious consciousness. Individual conscience, freedom, Holy Scripture study foregrounded, promoted printed texts, spread, growing education level. Beside these, many developments played role: modernity transition, capitalism, early modern economy rise, nation-states emergence, science, empirical observation growing importance, bourgeoisie ascent, Renaissance art, new human image. Middle Ages, long theocentric worldview marked God center, gradually replaced anthropocentric human world shaper. Modernity transition, thus not sudden dark age end, but intense change phase. Old structures crumbled, new orders arose. Medieval belief, divine providence, increasingly supplemented by trust, reason, discovery, experience, critique. Europe entered epoch-marked expansion, upheavals, innovations, but also conflicts, contradictions. With Middle Ages end began world history's modern sense era.